In the autumn of 1761, a wealthy merchant named Thomas Whitmore arrived at the gates of the Covenant Academy for Christian Youth in Salem, Massachusetts, demanding answers about his son's death. What he discovered within those hallowed halls would shake the very foundations of colonial society and expose a methodical system of brutality that had operated in plain sight for nearly 3 decades. The Fletcher family, Headmaster Josiah, his wife Martha, and their son Samuel, had built their reputation on providing superior Christian education to the children of New England's elite. But behind the academy's pristine facade of biblical instruction and moral discipline lay a calculated program of psychological and physical torment that claimed the lives of 89 young souls. The truth about the Covenant Academy would remain buried for centuries, concealed by powerful families who had too much to lose until now. Documents discovered in 1987 during the renovation of Salem's Old North Church revealed the extent of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of colonial government. Letters written in cipher, financial records detailing payments for experimental educational methods, and most disturbing of all, detailed medical observations of students subjected to what the Academy termed intensive spiritual correction, a euphemism for torture techniques that would later be employed throughout the American colonies. The Fletcher Academy's influence extended far beyond its ivy-covered walls. Former students who survived the institution's brutal methods would go on to become judges, military officers, and colonial administrators, carrying with them an intimate understanding of how fear and pain could be used to control human behavior. The Academy's techniques would resurface during the Revolutionary War, the Indian Wars, and even in the early development of American prison systems. Before we unveil the dark secrets of Salem's most prestigious academy, this story isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to confront the depths of human cruelty, disguised as righteousness. If you're ready to join our community of true mystery seekers who dare to explore the shadows of American history, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. The truth we're about to reveal has been hidden for over 2 centuries, and it will change how you view the foundations of our nation. Now, let's step back to 1734, when the nightmare began in a community still haunted by its own dark past. Massachusetts Bay Colony, in the 1732nd, represented the pinnacle of Puritan civilization in the New World. Yet beneath its veneer of religious devotion lay currents of paranoia and control that would prove fertile ground for the Fletcher Academy's sinister experiments. Salem, once synonymous with hysteria and accusations of witchcraft, had transformed itself into a bustling center of religious orthodoxy and intellectual achievement. The town's narrow cobblestone streets, still stained with memories of the witch trials from 4 decades past, now bustled with merchants whose ships brought wealth from the Caribbean, and shipbuilders whose craftsmanship was renowned throughout the colonies, and scholars whose interpretations of scripture influenced religious thought from Boston to Charleston. The psychological scars of the witch trials had never fully healed. Salem's residents had learned harsh lessons about the dangers of speaking out against authority, the consequences of questioning established religious doctrine, and the swift punishment that awaited those who challenged the social order. This atmosphere of lingering fear and enforced conformity would prove essential to the Fletcher Academy's ability to operate without scrutiny for nearly 3 decades. It was in this environment of religious fervor and social ambition that Josiah Fletcher established his academy in the winter of 1734. A man of imposing stature who stood nearly 6'1", 2 foot tall, Fletcher possessed the rare combination of theological education from Harvard Divinity School and aristocratic connections that made him irresistible to Salem's elite families. His deep-set gray eyes seemed to penetrate the souls of those who spoke with him, and his voice, a resonant bass that could command absolute silence in any room, carried the authority of a man who believed himself to be an instrument of divine will. Fletcher's personal history added to his mystique and credibility. Born in 1685 to a family of prominent Massachusetts ministers, he had witnessed the Salem witch trials as a 9-year-old boy, an experience that he claimed had given him unique insights into the nature of human evil and the necessity of strict spiritual discipline. He often spoke of watching Bridge Bishop's execution from his father's shoulders, describing how the sight of justice being served had inspired his lifelong commitment to rooting out sin and corruption wherever it might hide. His wife, Martha Fletcher, née Thornfield, was equally formidable, a woman whose sharp intellect was matched only by her unwavering belief in the necessity of severe discipline to shape young minds. Martha came from a family of prominent Boston merchants who had made their fortune in the triangular trade, and her dowry had provided the initial funding for the Academy's establishment. At 38 years old when the Academy opened, she possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of Puritan theology and a talent for psychological manipulation that would prove crucial to the institution's darker purposes. Martha's appearance was deceptively maternal, soft brown hair always pulled back in a severe bun, kind blue eyes that could suddenly turn ice-cold when she detected disobedience, and a voice that could shift seamlessly from gentle encouragement to terrifying authority. She had studied the writings of Increase Mather and Cotton Mather extensively, and her interpretation of their teachings on child-rearing emphasized the complete breaking of a child's will as a prerequisite for spiritual salvation. Their son Samuel, 23 years old when the Academy opened, had inherited his parents' commanding presence and their uncompromising vision of Christian education. Tall and lean like his father, with his mother's piercing blue eyes and an intellect sharpened by years of intensive theological study, Samuel served as the Academy's chief disciplinarian and the primary implement of its most extreme corrective measures. He had spent 3 years studying at Yale College, where he had been exposed to the latest developments in moral philosophy and pedagogy, knowledge that he would later apply in developing the Academy's systematic approach to breaking human resistance. Samuel's role in the Academy's operations extended beyond simple discipline. He maintained detailed records of each student's response to various forms of pressure, documenting their breaking points, their methods of resistance, and the most effective techniques for overcoming their psychological defenses. His journals, written in a careful hand and filled with clinical observations, would later provide crucial evidence of the Academy's true purpose. The Covenant Academy occupied a sprawling estate on the outskirts of Salem, positioned strategically on a hill that overlooked the town while remaining sufficiently isolated to conduct its operations without interference. The property had belonged to William Phipps, a wealthy merchant who had fled Massachusetts during the witch trials after his wife was accused of witchcraft. The abandoned estate, with its reputation for being cursed, had been available for purchase at a fraction of its actual value, allowing the Fletchers to acquire a facility far grander than their initial funding would normally have allowed. The main academic building, constructed of red brick, imported from England, rose 3 stories high, with its windows arranged in perfect symmetry that reflected the Puritan obsession with order and control. The structure's most striking feature was its central tower, which housed a bell cast in London and inscribed with verses from Ecclesiastes about the value of discipline and correction. The bell's bronze surface bore a patina that gave it an ominous dark green color, and its sound, a deep, mournful tone that could be heard for miles, called students to prayer 7 times daily from dawn until well after sunset. The interior of the main building reflected the Fletchers' commitment to both education and intimidation. The ground floor contained classrooms with high ceilings and tall windows that let in abundant light during the day, but created deep shadows that seemed to move independently in the flickering candlelight used for evening sessions. The walls were lined with portraits of stern Puritan ministers and biblical scenes depicting divine punishment, creating an atmosphere of constant moral scrutiny. The second floor housed the Academy's library, which contained one of the most extensive collections of theological texts in New England. In addition to standard religious works, the library included treatises on moral philosophy, human nature, and the psychology of spiritual conversion that provided the theoretical foundation for the Academy's experimental methods. A special section, accessible only to the Fletcher family and their most trusted associates, contained works on interrogation techniques, torture methods used during the Spanish Inquisition, and detailed accounts of the Salem witch trials that provided practical guidance for breaking human resistance. The third floor contained the Fletchers' private quarters and a series of small rooms used for what they termed individual spiritual counseling. These rooms, each measuring barely 8 foot by 10 foot, were furnished only with a simple wooden chair, a small table containing a Bible and prayer book, and a single candle for illumination. The walls were painted white and decorated with passages from Scripture that emphasized themes of judgment, punishment, and the necessity of complete submission to divine authority. Dormitories flanked the compound's eastern and western sides, housing 35 students in conditions that balanced comfort with institutional control. Each dormitory contained 18 beds arranged in perfect rows, with students assigned roommates based on a complex system that took into account their family backgrounds, academic abilities, and psychological profiles. The dormitories were supervised by older students who had proven their loyalty to the academy's methods and who served as informants, reporting on any signs of rebellion or independent thinking among their younger peers. The academy's chapel, built in the stark Puritan style with plain glass windows and unadorned wooden pews, dominated the northern end of the grounds. The building's most distinctive feature was its pulpit, carved from a single piece of oak and elevated nearly 8 foot above the congregation to emphasize the minister's authority over his audience. The chapel's acoustics were designed to amplify every word spoken from the pulpit while making whispered conversations among the congregation clearly audible to anyone standing at the front of the room. Behind the chapel lay the academy's cemetery, a small plot surrounded by a wrought iron fence that would eventually contain 89 small headstones bearing the names of students who had died during their enrollment. The cemetery's location, visible from most of the dormitory windows, served as a constant reminder to students of the potential consequences of failing to meet the academy's expectations. The most sinister aspect of the academy's physical plant lay hidden beneath the main building. The basement, carved from the estate's original stone foundation, contained a series of chambers that the Fletchers euphemistically termed reflection rooms. These spaces, varying in size from tiny cells, barely large enough for a grown man to lie down, to larger chambers that could accommodate multiple occupants, were designed specifically for the implementation of the academy's most extreme disciplinary measures. The Fletcher family marketed their institution as a sanctuary of learning where young Christian gentlemen would be molded into leaders of tomorrow's colonial society. Their promotional materials, distributed to wealthy families throughout New England, promised a curriculum that combined classical education with intensive biblical study, supervised by instructors who had studied at Harvard and Yale. The academy's tuition, nearly $100 per year, cost more than most families earned in 2 years, ensuring that only the children of merchants, ministers, and colonial officials could afford enrollment. This exclusivity was not merely a matter of prestige. It was essential to the academy's true purpose. The children of elite families possessed certain characteristics that made them ideal subjects for the Fletchers' experiments. They were accustomed to privilege and comfort, making them more susceptible to the psychological impact of deprivation and harsh treatment. Their family connections provided protection from outside scrutiny, as parents were reluctant to admit that their children might be suffering abuse at such a prestigious institution. Most importantly, these students represented the next generation of colonial leadership, and their conditioning at the academy would influence their approach to governance and social control throughout their adult lives. From the academy's first year, the Fletchers implemented what they termed biblical discipline, a system of correction supposedly based on Old Testament principles, but actually derived from torture techniques developed during the Spanish Inquisition and refined through careful study of the Salem witch trials. Students who arrived each September quickly learned that minor infractions could result in hours of forced kneeling on rough wooden floors, memorization of entire biblical books under threat of severe punishment for any errors, or confinement in the academy's reflection chambers, where boys were left alone with nothing but bread, water, and scripture to contemplate their sins. The academy's daily routine was designed to maintain constant psychological pressure on its students while creating an appearance of normal educational activity for any outside observers. Students rose at 5 o'clock each morning to the sound of the chapel bell and began their day with an hour of silent prayer in the chapel. Breakfast consisted of simple fare, porridge, bread, and weak beer, consumed in complete silence, while one of the Fletcher family members read passages from Scripture emphasizing themes of obedience, suffering, and divine judgment. O Evento Sombrio. The 15th of October, 1734 marked the first death at the Covenant Academy, though it would take decades before anyone understood its true significance as the beginning of a systematic program of human experimentation disguised as religious education. One 4-year-old, Benjamin Hartwell, son of a prosperous Salem shipbuilder whose vessels carried goods throughout the Atlantic trade routes, he was found dead in his dormitory bed on a cold Tuesday morning when the first frost of winter had settled over Massachusetts like a shroud of impending doom. Benjamin had arrived at the academy 6 weeks earlier, full of enthusiasm for his educational opportunities and eager to make his family proud. His father, Cornelius Hartwell, had built his shipping empire through careful planning and attention to detail, qualities he hoped his son would develop through exposure to the Fletcher's rigorous academic program. The family had paid the academy substantial tuition without hesitation, viewing it as an investment in Benjamin's future as a leader in colonial society. The boy's first weeks at the academy had proceeded according to plan. Benjamin excelled in his Latin studies, demonstrated a remarkable memory for biblical passages, and showed the kind of intellectual curiosity that his teachers praised as evidence of a keen mind destined for great achievements. His letters home, written in a careful hand and filled with expressions of gratitude for the opportunity to study at such a prestigious institution, gave his parents no reason for concern. The incident that led to Benjamin's death began on the 12th of October during the academy's evening prayer service in the chapel. As the students knelt on the hard wooden floor for what was scheduled to be a 3-minute session of silent contemplation, Benjamin committed what would prove to be a fatal error. He smiled, the expression barely perceptible to his fellow students, but clearly visible to Samuel Fletcher, who was monitoring the chapel from his position near the altar, was triggered by a memory of his younger sister's attempts to imitate their mother's stern expressions during family prayers. Samuel Fletcher's response was swift and decisive. As the prayer session concluded, he approached Benjamin and informed him that his display of levity during sacred worship indicated a dangerous lack of spiritual seriousness that required immediate correction. Benjamin's attempt to explain that he had been thinking of his family only confirmed Samuel's assessment that the boy's mind was insufficiently focused on divine matters. The punishment for Benjamin's transgression was confinement in one of the basement reflection chambers for a period that Samuel described as however long necessary for true repentance to take root in his heart. The chamber assigned to Benjamin measured 6 foot by 8 foot, with a vated stone ceiling so low that an adult could not stand upright. The walls, carved from the estate's original foundation stones, wept with moisture from the October rains, and the floor consisted of rough wooden planks that had warped over time, creating gaps that allowed cold air to seep up from the earth below. During his 3 days in the reflection chamber, Benjamin was provided with only water and a single piece of bread each morning, delivered by a silent older student who had been instructed to avoid any conversation or expressions of sympathy. The chamber contained no furniture except for a wooden bucket that served as a chamber pot and a single candle that was lit for 1 hour each evening to allow Benjamin to read selected passages from Scripture that emphasized themes of divine punishment and the necessity of complete submission to authority. Martha Fletcher visited Benjamin each evening to conduct what she termed spiritual counseling sessions, extended conversations designed to break down his psychological resistance and extract confessions of various sins and character flaws. These sessions, which lasted between 2 and 4 hours each night, followed a carefully developed pattern that Martha had refined through her study of interrogation techniques used during the Salem witch trials. Martha would begin each session with expressions of maternal concern, speaking in gentle tones about her worry for Benjamin's spiritual welfare and her desire to help him overcome the pride and worldliness that had led to his punishment. She would gradually shift to more aggressive questioning about his thoughts during prayer, his relationships with other students, his feelings about his family, and his understanding of his place in God's divine plan. As the sessions progressed, Martha employed increasingly sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques. She would alternate between promises of mercy and threats of eternal damnation, create false emergencies involving Benjamin's family to test his emotional responses, and present him with impossible theological puzzles designed to demonstrate his intellectual inadequacy and spiritual confusion. By the third day of Benjamin's confinement, the combination of physical deprivation, psychological pressure, and social isolation had begun to take its toll. The older student, who delivered his daily ration, reported that Benjamin had started talking to himself during the night, reciting biblical passages in a voice that grew increasingly hoarse and desperate. On the morning of the 15th of October, when the student arrived with Benjamin's bread and water, he found the boy lying motionless on the chamber floor, his eyes fixed open in an expression of terror that suggested his final moments had been filled with unimaginable anguish. The discovery of Benjamin's body created the first test of the Academy's ability to control the narrative surrounding student deaths. Samuel Fletcher immediately summoned his parents, and together they developed a story that would become the template for explaining future fatalities. Benjamin had died of sudden fever brought on by spiritual conviction, a condition that they claimed sometimes affected sensitive young souls when they experienced profound religious awakening. Martha Fletcher personally examined Benjamin's body and pronounced that his peaceful expression indicated he had achieved a state of spiritual ecstasy in his final moments. She claimed to have witnessed similar phenomena during her own religious experiences and assured the other students that Benjamin's death represented the highest form of spiritual achievement possible for a young Christian. The official cause of death, as recorded in the Academy's medical log, was acute fever accompanied by spiritual rapture, resulting in the soul's voluntary departure from earthly concerns. This explanation was supported by a detailed account of Benjamin's final days that portrayed his suffering as a willing embrace of divine discipline and his death as a blessed release from the burden of mortal existence. Headmaster Fletcher addressed the Academy's students and faculty that evening in the chapel, delivering a sermon that transformed Benjamin's death from a tragedy into an inspiration. Standing at the elevated pulpit with the autumn wind rattling the windows behind him, Fletcher spoke of the blessed nature of Benjamin's transition and the lesson it provided for all who witnessed it. Young Master Hartwell has received the greatest gift our Lord can bestow upon a faithful servant, Fletcher declared, his voice carrying the authority that had made him one of the most respected religious figures in Massachusetts. He has been called home at the moment of his greatest spiritual purity, when his soul had been purified through suffering and made worthy of immediate entrance into heaven's glory. Let his sacrifice serve as inspiration for your own dedication to righteousness and your willingness to embrace whatever trials God may send to test your faith. The students, 32 boys between the ages of 12 and 17, listened to Fletcher's sermon with a mixture of fear and fascination that would characterize their response to the many deaths that would follow. They had witnessed Benjamin's removal from the reflection chamber that morning, had seen his still form carried up the narrow stone stairs by Samuel Fletcher, and two older students had noticed his blue lips and the terror frozen in his open eyes. But Fletcher's sermon reframed these disturbing images as evidence of divine favor rather than human cruelty. That evening, as autumn wind rattled the dormitory windows and sent shadows dancing across the walls, whispered conversations among the students revealed the profound impact of Benjamin's death on the Academy's social dynamics. Some boys expressed admiration for Benjamin's spiritual achievement and wondered if they possessed the faith necessary to endure similar trials. Others spoke in hushed tones about the sounds they had heard echoing from the basement during Benjamin's final night, cries that had continued until just before dawn, when a sudden silence had fallen over the Academy like a blanket of death. One 2-year-old Timothy Morrison, whose father controlled much of Boston's shipping trade and whose family connections made him one of the most influential students at the Academy, confided to his roommate that the sounds from the basement had haunted his dreams. Timothy described hearing what seemed to be prayers, spoken in a voice that grew increasingly desperate and incoherent as the night progressed, followed by periods of silence that were somehow more terrifying than the crying itself. But when Timothy attempted to share these observations during the next day's scripture study, Professor Samuel Fletcher's stern gaze silenced him before he could speak. The look that passed between them contained a clear message. Certain subjects were not appropriate for discussion, and students who violated this understanding would find themselves facing consequences far more severe than simple academic discipline. The response from Salem's community to news of Benjamin's death was exactly what the Fletchers had anticipated and carefully orchestrated through their extensive network of religious and social connections. Rather than suspicion or concern about the circumstances surrounding the boy's demise, the community's reaction was an outpouring of sympathy for the academy and admiration for the spiritual intensity of its educational program. Reverend Cotton Mather, the legendary minister whose sermons had helped fuel the Salem witch trials and whose theological writings continued to influence Puritan thought throughout New England, praised the Fletchers publicly for creating an institution where young men could experience genuine spiritual awakening, even unto the ultimate sacrifice of earthly concerns for heavenly glory. Mather's endorsement, published in the Massachusetts Gazette and reprinted in religious publications throughout the colonies, portrayed Benjamin's death as evidence of the Academy's unprecedented success in fostering deep religious commitment among its students. Several wealthy families immediately submitted applications for their own sons after reading Mather's praise, viewing Benjamin's death as confirmation of the Academy's ability to produce the kind of spiritual transformation that they believed would serve their children well in their future careers as colonial leaders. The Academy's waiting list grew from a handful of names to more than 50 prospective students within weeks of Benjamin's death, forcing the Fletchers to become even more selective in their admission process. This increased demand for enrollment allowed the Fletchers to implement additional screening procedures designed to identify students who would be most suitable for their experimental program. They began requiring extensive interviews with both parents and prospective students, detailed medical examinations to assess physical resilience, and psychological evaluations that help determine each applicant's likely response to various forms of pressure and manipulation. The years following Benjamin Hartwell's death established a pattern that would define the Covenant Academy for the next 2 decades, transforming it from an educational institution into a laboratory for human experimentation, where the boundaries between discipline and torture became increasingly blurred. Deaths occurred with disturbing regularity, never more than 6 in a single year to avoid attracting unwanted attention, never fewer than 2 to maintain the experimental program's momentum. The Academy's enrollment remained constant at 35 students, as new arrivals quickly replaced those who had graduated to heavenly glory, as Martha Fletcher delicately phrased it in her correspondence with parents. This careful management of numbers allowed the Fletchers to maintain the appearance of a stable educational institution while ensuring a steady supply of test subjects for their increasingly sophisticated experiments in psychological and physical coercion. Each death followed a similar trajectory that became more refined with experience. A student would commit some minor transgression, speaking out of turn during prayers, failing to complete scripture memorization within the allotted time, showing insufficient enthusiasm during chapel services, expressing homesickness or doubt about religious doctrine, and would be sentenced to intensive reflection in the basement chambers. The duration of these punishments varied based on factors that the Fletchers carefully documented: the student's family background, his physical constitution, his psychological profile, and the specific experimental protocol being tested. The basement chambers themselves evolved during this period from simple confinement spaces into sophisticated torture facilities designed to test different variables in the breaking of human resistance. The Fletchers expanded the underground complex, adding chambers of varying sizes and configurations, each designed to produce specific psychological and physical effects on their occupants. The smallest chambers, measuring barely 4 foot x 6 foot, with ceilings only 5 foot high, were used for experiments in claustrophobia and spatial disorientation. Students confined in these spaces quickly developed acute anxiety, followed by panic attacks, and eventually complete psychological breakdown as their minds struggled to cope with the inability to stand upright or move freely. Larger chambers, some measuring 12 foot x 15 foot, were used for isolation experiments designed to test the effects of prolonged sensory deprivation. These rooms were painted completely black and contained no furniture except for a wooden bucket and a single straw mattress that was often removed to force subjects to sleep on the cold stone floor. The most sophisticated chambers incorporated features designed to create specific forms of psychological pressure. Some contained sloped floors that made it impossible to lie down comfortably, forcing occupants to remain in awkward positions that gradually wore down their physical and mental resistance. Others had walls that gradually tapered inward, creating an illusion that the space was slowly shrinking and triggering intense claustrophobic responses. Martha Fletcher developed increasingly elaborate protocols for her spiritual counseling sessions, which served as the psychological component of the Academy's experimental program. These sessions, conducted in specially designed rooms on the third floor of the main building, employed techniques that she had derived from her extensive study of interrogation methods used during the Spanish Inquisition and the Salem witch trials. Martha's approach involved creating detailed psychological profiles of each student, identifying their specific fears, attachments, and sources of emotional vulnerability. She would then systematically exploit these weaknesses through a combination of false information, emotional manipulation, and carefully orchestrated psychological pressure designed to produce complete mental breakdown. For students who showed strong attachments to their families, Martha would create elaborate deceptions involving fake letters describing family tragedies, financial ruin, or moral scandals. Students with academic ambitions were told that their families had disowned them for failing to meet expectations at the Academy. Those who expressed religious doubts were convinced that they had committed unforgivable sins that would damn them to eternal suffering regardless of their future behavior. Samuel Fletcher's role in the Academy's operations expanded during this period, as he took responsibility for documenting the experimental program's results and developing new techniques based on their findings. His journals, written in a careful hand and filled with clinical observations, recorded detailed information about each student's response to various forms of physical and psychological pressure. Samuel's documentation included precise measurements of how long different students could survive under various conditions. What combination of deprivation and psychological pressure produced the most rapid psychological breakdown? And which techniques were most effective at extracting confessions or compliance from resistant subjects? His work represented some of the earliest systematic research into torture techniques conducted in the American colonies, and his findings would later be distributed to colonial officials responsible for dealing with political dissident, criminal suspects. By 1740, the Academy had perfected its system of documentation and public relations. Martha Fletcher maintained meticulous records of each student's spiritual journey, including detailed descriptions of their final moments that invariably portrayed death as a blessed release from earthly suffering. These records, bound in leather volumes and stored in the Academy's library, served as both historical documentation and marketing materials for prospective families. The Academy's public image was carefully cultivated through a network of alumni, parents, and religious leaders who'd been convinced of the institution's value through various means. Former students who survived their experience at the Academy carried with them a profound understanding that speaking about their experiences would result in consequences far worse than death. This understanding was reinforced through periodic visits from Samuel Fletcher, who would appear at alumni gatherings to renew old friendships and remind former students of their ongoing obligations to maintain the Academy's reputation. Parents who had lost children at the Academy received regular correspondence from Martha Fletcher, including anniversary letters on the dates of their sons' deaths that celebrated the spiritual significance of their sacrifice. These letters often included small mementos, pressed flowers from the Academy's gardens, copies of biblical passages that their sons had supposedly been studying at the time of their death, or sketches of the peaceful expressions that Martha claimed to have witnessed on their faces in their final moments. The surviving students developed their own methods of coping with the Academy's deadly routine, creating an underground culture of mutual support and shared survival strategies. They learned to recognize the signs that preceded selection for intensive reflection, the subtle hardening of Samuel Fletcher's expression during classroom discussions, the way Martha Fletcher's fingers would drum against her prayer book during chapel services, the particular tone Headmaster Fletcher used when discussing spiritual purification during his sermons. Most importantly, they learned absolute silence about what they witnessed. This silence was maintained through a combination of terror and indoctrination that made the students complicit in the Academy's operations. Boys who survived their years at the Academy understood that their continued existence depended on their willingness to participate in a system that regularly claimed the lives of their classmates. The Academy's reputation continued to grow throughout the 1742nd, even as whispers occasionally surfaced in Salem's taverns and marketplaces. Some citizens noted the unusually high mortality rate among the academy students, but these concerns were quickly dismissed by the town's influential families, many of whom had financial or social connections to the institution. Dr. Ephraim Wilkins, Salem's most respected physician, occasionally raised questions about the medical explanations provided for student deaths at the academy. Wilkins had examined several of the bodies and noted physical evidence that seemed inconsistent with the spiritual fever diagnosis that the Fletchers routinely provided. However, his concerns were addressed through a combination of social pressure and financial incentives that convinced him to accept the academy's explanations without further investigation. The few individuals who attempted to investigate more deeply found themselves facing social ostracism or economic pressure that forced them to abandon their inquiries. Thomas Blackwood, a local magistrate who had begun asking questions about the academy's operations after receiving an anonymous letter describing suspicious activities on the campus, was suddenly faced with accusations of financial impropriety that forced him to resign from his position and leave Salem entirely. Salem's religious establishment provided crucial support for the academy's continued operation during this period. Local ministers regularly visited the campus to deliver guest sermons, and several prominent theologians praised the Fletchers' educational methods in published treatises that were distributed throughout New England. The Academy's chapel hosted some of the most prestigious religious ceremonies in Massachusetts, including the ordination of several ministers who would later become leaders in the Great Awakening Revival movement. Reverend Jonathan Edwards, whose theological writings would profoundly influence American Protestant thought for generations, visited the academy in 1743 and delivered a sermon praising the Fletchers' commitment to breaking the natural depravity of young hearts through whatever means divine providence might require. Edwards' endorsement was particularly valuable because of his reputation as one of the most brilliant theological minds of his generation, and his support helped silence critics who might otherwise have questioned the Academy's methods. Yet, beneath this veneer of respectability, the Academy's true purpose was gradually revealing itself to a small circle of colonial officials who had been briefed on the experimental program's objectives. The Fletchers were not simply running a school. They were conducting systematic research into human endurance and control that would provide valuable intelligence for colonial authorities seeking more effective methods of maintaining social order in an increasingly restive population. The techniques developed at the Academy were being tested in response to growing concerns among colonial leaders about the loyalty of the population. As tensions with Britain continued to escalate, the methods of psychological manipulation and physical coercion that the Fletchers perfected would prove invaluable for dealing with political dissident, religious minorities, and anyone else who challenged the established order. The winter of 1747 brought an unexpected complication to the Academy's operations that would ultimately lead to its exposure more than a decade later. Jonathan Prescott, a 16-year-old student whose father served as chief magistrate for Essex County, began maintaining a secret journal documenting the daily activities at the Covenant Academy. Unlike his fellow students who had learned to suppress their observations and emotions as a survival mechanism, Jonathan possessed an analytical mind and an unshakable moral conviction that compelled him to record what he witnessed, regardless of the personal risk involved. Jonathan came from a family with a distinguished history of public service in Massachusetts. His grandfather had served as a judge during the Salem witch trials, and his father, Magistrate William Prescott, was widely respected for his fairness and integrity in dealing with legal matters throughout Essex County. The Prescott family's reputation for moral courage and intellectual honesty had been carefully cultivated over 3 generations, and Jonathan had been raised with a strong sense of duty to document and bear witness to injustice wherever he encountered it. Jonathan's journal, written in a careful hand and hidden within the binding of his prayer book through an ingenious method he had developed using a small knife and considerable patience, contained detailed accounts of the Academy's punishment system that would later prove crucial to understanding the full scope of the Fletchers' experimental program. He documented the dimensions of the basement reflection chambers, noting that they varied in size from tiny cells barely large enough for a child to lie down to larger spaces that could accommodate multiple occupants. More significantly, Jonathan began to discern patterns in the Fletcher's selection of victims that revealed the systematic nature of their operations. His observations, recorded with the precision of a trained researcher, despite his youth, showed that the Academy's disciplinary system was not random punishment for infractions, but rather a carefully designed program for testing different variables in human psychology and physiology. "The masters do not choose randomly among us for their special attentions," Jonathan wrote in an entry dated the 12th of February, 1748. "They observe each student with the care of natural philosophers studying specimens, noting which among us possess the strongest will, the greatest capacity for independent thought, or the most resilient constitution. Those who show signs of natural leadership, who ask penetrating questions during scripture study, or who demonstrate unusual physical stamina are marked for what they term advanced spiritual development." Jonathan's analysis revealed that the Fletchers had developed a sophisticated classification system for categorizing students based on their potential value as experimental subjects. Students with strong family connections were often subjected to psychological experiments designed to test the effectiveness of various forms of emotional manipulation. Those from families with military backgrounds were used to test physical endurance and pain tolerance. Students who showed exceptional intelligence were subjected to complex psychological experiments designed to determine the most effective methods for breaking intellectual resistance to authority. Most disturbing of all, Jonathan discovered that the Academy was maintaining detailed correspondence with colonial officials regarding the effectiveness of various torture techniques being developed and tested on the students. These officials, including high-ranking members of the Massachusetts colonial government, were providing funding for the experimental program and receiving regular reports on its progress. Jonathan's fears about his own situation proved prescient as winter progressed into spring. By March of 1748, he noticed that Samuel Fletcher had begun singling him out during classroom discussions, asking increasingly complex theological questions designed to trap him in statements that could be construed as heretical or rebellious. These questions, which appeared to be normal academic exercises to other students, were actually carefully crafted tests designed to assess Jonathan's psychological profile and determine his suitability for specific experimental protocols. Martha Fletcher, meanwhile, had started requiring Jonathan to spend additional hours in private prayer, ostensibly to help him overcome what she termed intellectual pride and spiritual arrogance. These sessions, conducted in one of the third-floor counseling rooms, allowed Martha to conduct preliminary psychological evaluations that would inform the design of more intensive interventions if Jonathan were selected for the experimental program. As winter gave way to spring, Jonathan made a discovery that would fundamentally change his understanding of the Academy's true purpose and place it within a broader context of colonial policy and social control. While cleaning the headmaster's office as punishment for a minor infraction, arriving 2 minutes late to morning chapel, he discovered a locked cabinet containing correspondence between Josiah Fletcher and various colonial officials throughout New England. The letters, which Jonathan managed to read during several clandestine visits to the office over the course of 3 weeks, revealed that the Covenant Academy was part of a larger network of institutions throughout the colonies that were developing techniques for what the correspondence euphemistically termed enhanced spiritual correction. These methods were being tested specifically for their potential application in dealing with political dissident, religious minorities, criminal suspects, and anyone else who might challenge colonial authority. One letter dated September 1747 and signed by Thomas Hutchinson, a high-ranking official in the Massachusetts colonial government, praised Fletcher's work in developing methods of spiritual correction that achieve desired behavioral modifications while maintaining plausible explanations for any unfortunate outcomes that may result from the implementation of such a technique. The letter went on to discuss plans for expanding the program to other educational institutions throughout New England, with particular emphasis on facilities that served the children of families whose loyalty to colonial authority might be questioned. Another document bearing the seal of the governor's office outlined the strategic importance of the Academy's work in preparing for what the writer termed the inevitable challenges to established order that will arise as Tensions with the mother country continue to escalate. The document specifically mentioned the value of having colonial leaders who had been conditioned through early exposure to understand the absolute necessity of maintaining social control through whatever means circumstances might require. Perhaps most chilling was a detailed report written by Samuel Fletcher and addressed to a committee of colonial officials describing the development of interrogation techniques that could extract reliable information from suspects while leaving minimal physical evidence of coercion. The report included precise descriptions of psychological pressure methods, optimal duration for various forms of deprivation, and recommendations for combining physical and mental torture to achieve maximum effectiveness. Jonathan realized that the students who died at the academy were not random victims of excessive religious discipline, but carefully selected test subjects in a systematic program of torture and psychological manipulation designed to develop techniques that would be used throughout the colonial justice system. The academy served as a laboratory where the methods of breaking human resistance could be refined and perfected under the cover of Christian education, with the added benefit that the victims came from families too prestigious to risk public scandal by questioning the institution's methods. This revelation coincided with increasing pressure from the Fletcher family, as Jonathan's name appeared more frequently in Martha Fletcher's reports of students requiring additional spiritual guidance. He began to receive invitations to private conferences with the headmaster that felt more like interrogations than educational meetings, with Josiah Fletcher asking probing questions about Jonathan's family's political views, his own thoughts about colonial governance, and his understanding of the proper relationship between individual conscience and institutional authority. The other students, sensing the danger surrounding their classmate, began to distance themselves from Jonathan, in accordance with survival instincts that had been honed by years of witnessing the consequences of association with those marked for special attention. This isolation was particularly painful for Jonathan, who had formed genuine friendships with several of his fellow students, but he understood that their behavior was driven by fear rather than callousness. During this period, Jonathan also began to notice changes in the academy's physical environment that suggested preparations for more intensive experimental activities. New equipment appeared in the basement chambers, including restraints, measuring devices, and what appeared to be medical instruments. The reflection chambers themselves were modified with improved ventilation systems that would allow for longer periods of confinement, and several new rooms were excavated from the foundation stones to accommodate expanded experimental protocols. The tension reached a breaking point in early April 1748 when Jonathan was discovered reading in the Academy's library after official study hours. The book he was reading, a treatise on natural philosophy by John Loach that questioned certain aspects of Puritan theology and emphasized the importance of individual reason in moral decision-making, provided Samuel Fletcher with the justification he needed to recommend Jonathan for intensive spiritual correction. The selection process that followed revealed the sophisticated bureaucracy that the Fletchers had developed to manage their experimental program. Jonathan's case was reviewed by all three family members, each of whom contributed assessments based on their area of expertise. Josiah Fletcher evaluated Jonathan's potential as a political threat. Considering his family background and the likelihood that he might use knowledge gained at the academy to challenge colonial authority in the future, Martha Fletcher assessed his psychological profile, determining which experimental protocols would be most effective in breaking his resistance while providing valuable data about the limits of intellectual subjects. Samuel Fletcher reviewed the physical evidence of Jonathan's transgression and recommended specific disciplinary measures that would serve both punitive and experimental purposes. The decision to subject Jonathan to intensive reflection was made during a family conference on the 17th of April, 1748, with the understanding that his case would provide crucial data about the effectiveness of their techniques when applied to subjects with strong intellectual capabilities and significant family connections. The Fletchers were particularly interested in testing whether their methods could successfully convert someone with Jonathan's background into a reliable supporter of their program, potentially creating a valuable asset within the colonial magistracy. The night of the 18th of April, 1748, 748, would become the turning point in the Covenant Academy's dark history, though it would take more than a decade for the full implications to become clear. As Jonathan Prescott was led down the stone steps to the basement reflection chamber, he carried with him not only his hidden journal, but also a desperate plan that had been weeks in the making and would eventually expose the Academy's true nature to the outside world. Jonathan had spent considerable time preparing for this moment, understanding that his selection for intensive reflection was inevitable, given his family background and his growing reputation as someone who asked too many questions. His preparation involved both physical conditioning, secretly exercising to build stamina and practicing techniques for remaining conscious under extreme stress, and strategic planning that took advantage of his unique position as the son of Essex County's chief magistrate. Over the previous months, Jonathan had established a sophisticated communication system with his father through coded messages embedded in his regular letters home. These codes, based on classical references that would be meaningful to an educated reader but invisible to casual observers, had allowed Jonathan to convey detailed information about the Academy's operations without alerting the Fletcher family to his surveillance activities. Chief Magistrate William Prescott, a shrewd man who had noticed subtle changes in his son's correspondence over the past year, had begun his own quiet investigation into the Academy's operations. Using his official authority and network of contacts throughout the colonial government, Prescott had uncovered disturbing evidence about the institution's true purpose and its connections to a broader program of social control being implemented throughout New England. The reflection chamber assigned to Jonathan was one of the Academy's newer facilities, measuring 8 foot by 10 foot with a vated stone ceiling that rose to nearly 7 foot at its highest point. Unlike the older chambers, this one contained several features that reflected the Fletcher's growing sophistication in designing spaces for psychological torture. A small iron grate near the ceiling provided minimal ventilation and a thin stream of light during daylight hours, while specially designed acoustics ensured that any sounds made by the chamber's occupant would be clearly audible to observers stationed in an adjacent monitoring room. The chamber's walls bore evidence of its previous occupants in the form of carved messages, scratched tallies marking days of confinement, and dark stains that Jonathan preferred not to examine too closely. Most disturbing were the iron rings set into the stone walls at various heights, clearly designed to accommodate restraints that could secure a prisoner in positions that would maximize both physical discomfort and psychological intimidation. As the heavy wooden door closed behind him with a sound that seemed to echo through his bones, Jonathan began implementing the survival strategy he had developed during weeks of careful planning. He had secreted away small amounts of food during the previous weeks, hiding them in the lining of his jacket, using techniques learned from his study of smuggling methods employed by colonial merchants seeking to avoid British customs duties. More importantly, Jonathan had prepared detailed documentation of the Academy's operations written in a cipher based on Latin conjugations that only someone with classical education would be able to decode. This documentation, which included maps of the basement level, descriptions of torture techniques he had witnessed, and copies of correspondence he had seen in the Hedham's office, and was hidden in multiple locations throughout the chamber, where previous occupants had carved desperate messages into the stone walls. The first 3 days of Jonathan's confinement proceeded according to the Academy's established experimental protocol. He received his daily ration of bread and water delivered by Thomas Whitmore's son Marcus, a 5-year-old student who had been selected for this duty specifically because his father's wealth and influence made him unlikely to show sympathy for Academy victims. Marcus delivered the rations in complete silence, avoiding eye contact and speaking only to recite a brief prayer, asking God to grant Jonathan the wisdom to embrace his suffering as a path to spiritual enlightenment. The psychological pressure intensified each evening when Martha Fletcher conducted her spiritual counseling sessions in the chamber itself, transforming the small space into an interrogation room where she employed increasingly sophisticated techniques designed to break down Jonathan's mental resistance. These sessions, which lasted between 3 and 6 hours each night, represented the culmination of Martha's years of study in psychological manipulation and her practical experience in breaking the will of dozens of previous subjects. Martha's approach with Jonathan was particularly systematic because of his intellectual capabilities and family connections. She began each session by expressing maternal concern for his welfare, speaking in gentle tones about her worry for his spiritual condition and her desire to help him overcome the pride and independence that had led to his current situation. She would then gradually shift to more aggressive questioning about his beliefs, his relationship with other students, his family's political affiliations, and his understanding of his proper place in colonial society. As the sessions progressed, Martha employed psychological techniques that revealed the sophisticated nature of the Academy's experimental program. She created false emergencies involving Jonathan's family to test his emotional responses, presented him with impossible theological puzzles designed to demonstrate his intellectual inadequacy, and systematically attacked every aspect of his identity and belief system in an effort to create complete psychological breakdown. Your father's position as magistrate has been called into question by reports of his son's heretical behavior. Martha informed Jonathan during their third session, producing what appeared to be official correspondence bearing the colonial seal. The governor himself has expressed concern about whether a man whose own child rebels against proper religious authority can be trusted with matters of public justice. Your continued resistance to spiritual correction is destroying your family's reputation and threatening their financial security. The documents Martha showed Jonathan were elaborate forgeries, but her knowledge of colonial politics and her understanding of his family's specific vulnerabilities made her deceptions remarkably convincing. She described in precise detail the mechanisms by which his father could be removed from office, the financial consequences that would follow, and the social ostracism that would destroy the Prescott family's standing in Massachusetts society. By the fourth day, however, Jonathan's extensive preparation began to pay dividends. While his body showed the expected signs of physical deprivation, weight loss, fatigue, and difficulty concentrating, his mind remained sharp enough to continue documenting his experiences and to recognize the sophisticated nature of Martha's psychological manipulation techniques. During the periods when he was alone in the chamber, Jonathan carved new messages into the stone walls using a metal fragment he had concealed in his shoe. These messages, written in his cipher, provided detailed accounts of the interrogation techniques being used against him, descriptions of the psychological pressure methods Martha employed, and most importantly, his growing understanding of the scientific methodology behind the Fletcher family's approach to breaking human resistance. Jonathan's analysis revealed that the Academy's torture program was not the product of religious fanaticism or sadistic pleasure, but rather a carefully designed research project with specific experimental objectives. Each student's responses to various forms of physical and psychological pressure were meticulously recorded, analyzed, and used to refine techniques that would be employed throughout the colonial justice system. The basement level contained multiple chambers of different sizes and configurations, each designed to test different variables in the process of breaking human resistance. Some chambers were used to study the effects of complete isolation, others tested responses to various forms of physical discomfort, and still others were designed to evaluate the effectiveness of different psychological pressure techniques. On the fifth day, something unprecedented occurred that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of both Jonathan's ordeal and the Academy's operations. Chief Magistrate Prescott arrived at the Academy unannounced, accompanied by 2 armed constables and bearing official documents that gave him authority to conduct an immediate inspection of the facility in response to concerns raised by reliable sources regarding the welfare of students enrolled at this institution. Prescott's unexpected visit created chaos in the normally regimented schedule of the Academy as the Fletcher family scrambled to maintain their facade while concealing the true nature of their operations. The presence of armed constables, in particular, sent a clear message that this was not a social visit or routine inspection, but rather an official investigation that could not be dismissed through the usual methods of social pressure and political influence. The magistrate's arrival had been carefully timed to coincide with the period when Jonathan would normally be receiving his evening ration, allowing Prescott to demand immediate access to his son. While the Fletchers were still adjusting to the unexpected disruption of their routine, this timing was not accidental. Jonathan's coded messages had provided his father with detailed information about the academy's daily schedule and the optimal moment for intervention. Josiah Fletcher's attempt to delay the magistrate's access to Jonathan by claiming that the boy was engaged in intensive prayer and meditation that should not be interrupted was met with a blunt refusal and a reminder that Prescott's authority superseded any religious considerations the academy might invoke. The magistrate's insistence on immediate access, backed by the visible presence of armed law enforcement officers, forced the Fletchers to abandon their usual tactics of manipulation and delay. This disruption provided Jonathan with an opportunity he had been waiting for throughout his 5 days of confinement. During the confusion created by his father's arrival and the Fletchers' desperate attempts to control the situation, he managed to slip his journal and other crucial documentation through the ventilation grate in his chamber, where they fell into a gap between the building's foundation stones that had been created by decades of settling and water damage. The evidence would remain hidden in this location for over a decade, protected from discovery by the narrow space and the fact that the Fletchers had no reason to suspect that detailed documentation of their activities had been preserved in such an inaccessible location. The survival of this evidence would ultimately prove crucial to exposing the full scope of the Academy's crimes when it was finally recovered during Thomas Whitmore's investigation in 1761. When the heavy door to Jonathan's chamber was finally opened, the scene that greeted Chief Magistrate Prescott provided immediate evidence of the true nature of the Academy's spiritual correction program. Jonathan, despite his careful preparation and strong constitution, showed clear signs of systematic abuse, significant weight loss, evidence of sleep deprivation, and psychological stress that was obvious even to casual observation. More damning was the condition of the chamber itself, which bore clear evidence of its use as a torture facility rather than a space for religious reflection. The iron restraint set into the walls, the carved messages left by previous occupants, and the overall design of the space made it impossible for the Fletchers to maintain their claim that they were simply providing enhanced religious education for their students. The confrontation that followed between Magistrate Prescott and the Fletcher family would expose the Academy's operations in ways that neither side had anticipated, setting in motion events that would ultimately lead to the institution's destruction, but only after claiming dozens more victims over the following 13 years. The confrontation between Chief Magistrate William Prescott and the Fletcher family on that April evening in 1748 would expose the Academy's operations in ways that neither side anticipated, revealing the true scope of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of colonial government and involved systematic human experimentation disguised as religious education. Prescott, a man whose position required him to navigate the complex and often treacherous politics of colonial Massachusetts, had arrived at the Academy armed with more than paternal concern. He carried with him evidence of the institution's true purpose that would force the Fletchers to reveal the full extent of their operations or face immediate prosecution for crimes that could result in their execution. During the weeks preceding his dramatic intervention, Prescott had conducted his own exhaustive investigation into the Academy's unusually high mortality rate and its connections to a broader network of experimental facilities operating throughout New England. Using his authority as chief magistrate and his extensive network of contacts within the colonial government, he had uncovered correspondence, financial records, and witness testimony that painted a disturbing picture of systematic torture and murder conducted under the cover of religious education. Prescott's investigation had revealed that the Covenant Academy was part of a larger program developed by colonial officials in response to growing concerns about maintaining social control in an increasingly restive population. As tensions with Britain continued to escalate and reports of rebellion and dissent multiplied throughout the colonies, colonial leaders had become convinced that traditional methods of law enforcement and social control were insufficient to meet the challenges they faced. The experimental program that included the Fletcher Academy was designed to develop more effective techniques for breaking individual resistance to authority, extracting information from suspected dissident, and creating psychological conditioning that would ensure long-term compliance with governmental directives. The choice to use elite educational institutions as testing grounds for these techniques was particularly cynical, as it provided perfect cover for the experimental program while ensuring that the children of the most influential families in colonial society would be conditioned to accept authoritarian methods of control. When Magistrate Prescott confronted Josiah Fletcher in the headmaster's office that evening, the conversation quickly moved beyond concerns about Jonathan's immediate welfare to a broader discussion of the academy's relationship with colonial authorities and its role in what Fletcher termed the development of enhanced methods for maintaining social order in challenging times. Fletcher, realizing that his operations had been discovered by someone with both the authority and the evidence necessary to expose them, made a calculated decision to reveal the full scope of the program in an attempt to convince Prescott that destroying the academy would be contrary to his own interests as a colonial official. The headmaster's gambit was based on his understanding that Prescott, like all magistrates in Massachusetts, ultimately depended on the colonial government for his authority, and that challenging the experimental program would be tantamount to challenging the entire system of colonial governance. "Your son has been selected for our most advanced curriculum, Magistrate Prescott," Fletcher explained, his voice carrying the same authority that had commanded respect throughout Salem for over a decade. "The techniques we have developed here through careful experimentation have proven invaluable to maintaining order throughout the colonies. Jonathan's intelligence, strong will, and family connections make him an ideal subject for our final phase of research into psychological modification and behavioral control." Fletcher went on to explain that the Academy's program had been developed in direct response to directives from the highest levels of colonial government, including Governor Jonathan Belcher himself and members of the Massachusetts Council, who were responsible for maintaining British authority in the face of growing colonial resistance. The students who died during the experimental process were not unfortunate casualties of excessive discipline but necessary sacrifices in the development of techniques that would ensure the stability of colonial society as tensions with Britain continued to escalate. The headmaster produced detailed correspondence from colonial officials that authorized and funded the experimental program, including letters from Thomas Hutchinson, who would later become the last civilian governor of Massachusetts before the Revolution. These documents revealed that the Academy's work was considered essential to colonial security and that its techniques were already being implemented in other facilities throughout New England and the other colonies. "We have developed methods that can break the strongest will, extract the most carefully guarded secrets, and transform even the most rebellious individual into a reliable supporter of established authority," Fletcher continued, his tone becoming increasingly confident as he sensed that Prescott was beginning to understand the implications of challenging such a well-connected program. "Your son's resistance to our initial techniques has provided valuable data about the limitations of our current methods and the need for more intensive approaches." Martha Fletcher joined the conversation at this point, bringing with her the detailed record she had maintained of Jonathan's responses to various forms of pressure during his 5 days of confinement. Her documentation revealed the sophisticated nature of the Academy's experimental protocols and the systematic approach they had developed to studying human psychology under extreme stress. "We have catalogued your son's reactions to isolation, deprivation, psychological manipulation, and physical discomfort," Martha explained, her voice clinical and detached as she reviewed the data she had collected. "His responses indicate an unusually strong psychological constitution that makes him an ideal candidate for our most advanced experimental protocols. We believe that successfully breaking someone of his intellectual capabilities and family background would provide crucial insights into how to handle similar cases among the colonial leadership." Martha's records revealed that the Fletchers had developed a comprehensive classification system for categorizing their experimental subjects based on psychological profiles, family backgrounds, and physical characteristics. Students from military families were used to test pain tolerance and physical endurance. Those from merchant families were subjected to psychological experiments involving false information about financial ruin and social disgrace. Children of religious leaders were exposed to techniques designed to break their faith and create dependency on alternative authority figures. Most disturbing of all was the revelation that the Academy maintained detailed correspondence with similar institutions throughout the colonies, sharing experimental results and coordinating research protocols to ensure that the most effective techniques were identified and disseminated to colonial officials responsible for law enforcement and social control. Samuel Fletcher contributed his own documentation to the discussion, producing journals filled with precise observations about the physiological and psychological effects of various torture techniques on different types of subjects. His work represented some of the earliest systematic research into what would later be recognized as psychological warfare and behavioral modification. Conducted with the ruthless precision of a natural philosopher studying laboratory specimens, we have determined the optimal duration for various forms of deprivation, the most effective combinations of physical and psychological pressure, and the precise methods for breaking resistance without leaving evidence that would compromise our operations, Samuel explained, his tone reflecting the pride he took in his scientific achievements. Your son's case has allowed us to test our most advanced techniques against a subject with exceptional intellectual and psychological resources. The true horror of the Fletcher Academy was not simply the deaths of 89 students over the course of 14 years, but the systematic development of torture and psychological manipulation techniques that were being employed against countless other victims throughout the colonial period. The academy served as a prototype for methods of control and intimidation that would later be used against political dissident, religious minorities, suspected criminals, and anyone who challenged the established order. Chief Magistrate Prescott found himself facing an impossible choice that would define the remainder of his career and his family's future in Massachusetts. He could expose the academy's operations and potentially save his son, but doing so would also reveal his own knowledge of a program that enjoyed the support of the colonial government's highest officials. The experimental program represented a significant investment of both financial resources and political capital, and Prescott's position as magistrate depended on his willingness to support the broader system of social control that the academy represented. The negotiation that followed would determine not only Jonathan's immediate fate, but also the future direction of the academy's operations and the magistrate's own survival in the complex political environment of colonial Massachusetts. Fletcher offered to release Jonathan immediately and ensure that no member of the Prescott family would ever be subjected to similar treatment, but only in exchange for the magistrate's continued silence and his active cooperation in expanding the experimental program to other institutions throughout Essex County. You have two choices, Magistrate, Fletcher stated with calm certainty. You can attempt to expose our operations and find yourself facing charges of treason against the colonial government. Or you can accept the reality of your situation and work with us to ensure that these valuable techniques are employed in service of maintaining order throughout your jurisdiction. Your son's experience here has demonstrated the effectiveness of our methods, but it has also shown us the need for more subtle approaches when dealing with subjects from influential families. Prescott's response to this ultimatum would establish a precedent that would eventually lead to the academy's downfall, though not before it claimed dozens more victims and established techniques that would haunt American law enforcement and military operations for generations to come. The magistrate agreed to Fletcher's terms with one crucial modification that would ultimately prove to be the academy's undoing. He demanded written documentation of his agreement with the Fletcher family, including detailed records of the experimental program and its official authorization. This documentation, which Fletcher provided in an attempt to ensure Prescott's continued cooperation, would eventually fall into the hands of Thomas Whitmore during his investigation 13 years later, providing the evidence necessary to expose the full scope of the academy's crimes and its connections to the broader colonial conspiracy. The final chapter of the Fletcher Academy story began in the winter of 1761, when Thomas Whitmore's investigation into his son's death uncovered evidence that would finally expose the institution's true nature and reveal the extent of a conspiracy that had claimed nearly a century of young lives while developing techniques of torture and control that would influence American history for generating eons to come. Whitmore, a wealthy merchant whose shipping empire had made him one of the most powerful men in New England, possessed both the financial resources and the political connections necessary to challenge the academy's operations in ways that previous parents had been unable or unwilling to attempt. Whitmore's son, Marcus, had died at the academy in November 1760, reportedly from the same sudden fever brought on by spiritual conviction that had claimed so many students before him. But unlike other parents who had accepted the Fletcher family's explanations with varying degrees of suspicion and grief, Whitmore approached his son's death with the analytical mindset of a successful businessman who had built his fortune through careful investigation and strategic planning. The merchant's initial suspicions were aroused by subtle inconsistencies in the academy's account of Marcus's final days, including medical details that seemed implausible to someone with Whitmore's extensive experience in maritime medicine and his knowledge of the physical effects of various diseases and conditions. More importantly, Whitmore had received a letter from his son just 3 days before Marcus's death that described the academy's operations in terms that contradicted the official explanation of voluntary spiritual discipline and religious enthusiasm. Marcus's letter, written in careful language that avoided direct criticism of the academy while conveying detailed information about its operations, described a system of punishment and control that bore no resemblance to the educational environment that the Fletchers promoted in their public communications. The letter mentioned students who had disappeared after being selected for special spiritual guidance, described the sounds that echoed from the basement during nighttime hours, and expressed concern about the academy's true purpose in terms that suggested Marcus had begun to understand the danger he faced. Armed with this evidence, and driven by a father's grief that had transformed into cold determination, Whitmore hired a team of private investigators with experience in both colonial law enforcement and commercial intelligence gathering. These investigators, led by former magistrate Thomas Blackwood, the same man who had been forced to leave Salem 13 years earlier after asking too many questions about the academy, began a systematic examination of the institution's operations that would ultimately uncover evidence of crimes spanning nearly 3 decades. The breakthrough in Whitmore's investigation came when Blackwood's team discovered Jonathan Prescott's journal and other documentation hidden in the foundation stones of the basement reflection chambers. This evidence, preserved in remarkable condition by the dry environment and narrow space that had protected it from discovery, provided detailed accounts of the academy's experimental protocols, descriptions of torture techniques that had been developed and tested on students, and most crucially, copies of correspondence that revealed the program's connections to colonial officials throughout New England. Jonathan's documentation proved that the Fletcher Academy was not an isolated case of institutional abuse, but rather a key component of a broader network of experimental facilities that had been operating throughout the colonies for decades. The techniques developed at the academy had been disseminated to other institutions, employed by colonial law enforcement agencies, and even exported to British military operations in other parts of the empire. The journal entries revealed the sophisticated nature of the academy's experimental program, including detailed descriptions of different types of torture chambers, systematic approaches to psychological manipulation, and careful documentation of how different subjects responded to various forms of pressure. Most damning of all were Jonathan's transcriptions of correspondence between the academy and colonial officials that explicitly authorized the experimental program and provided funding for its continued operation. Armed with this evidence, Whitmore was able to build a case against the Fletcher family that extended beyond simple criminal charges to include treason against the British Crown. The academy's experimental program had been conducted without proper authorization from British authorities, and many of the techniques that had been developed were being used by colonial officials to undermine royal authority rather than support it. The exposure of the academy's operations created a crisis for the Massachusetts colonial government, which found itself forced to choose between supporting an illegal experimental program that had operated without British knowledge or approval and maintaining its relationship with royal authorities, who were increasingly suspicious of colonial loyalty. The decision to abandon the Fletcher family and cooperate with British investigators represented a significant shift in colonial policy and would have far-reaching consequences for the relationship between colonial and royal authorities in The years leading up to the revolution, the investigation that followed Whitmore's revelations uncovered evidence of similar programs operating at institutions throughout New England, including several schools, seminaries, and even some churches that had been conducting experiments in human psychology and control under various forms of cover. The network of facilities was more extensive than anyone had suspected, involving hundreds of officials and affecting thousands of victims over the course of several decades. Josiah Fletcher was arrested in February 1762 on charges that included murder, torture, treason, and conspiracy against the crown. However, he died in custody before his trial could begin, reportedly from a heart attack brought on by the stress of his confinement, though some contemporary accounts suggested that his death was orchestrated to prevent him from revealing the full extent of the experimental program and its connections to colonial officials. Martha Fletcher and her son Samuel were convicted of multiple charges related to the deaths of students at the academy, but their trials were conducted in secret to prevent public exposure of the experimental program's true scope. Both were executed quietly in the spring of 1762, with official records indicating that they had died of natural causes while serving prison sentences for educational malpractice. The Covenant Academy was officially closed in March 1762, and its buildings were demolished by order of the colonial government to prevent them from becoming a shrine to the victims of the experimental program. The demolition was conducted by workers who had been sworn to secrecy about the true nature of the buildings they were destroying, and the site was subsequently sold to a local farmer who reportedly refused to plant crops on the land where the academy had stood. The farmer, Ezekiel Morrison, later told his neighbors that the soil in the area where the academy's basement had been located was cursed by the innocent blood that had been spilled there, and that attempts to grow crops in that soil resulted in plants that grew in twisted, unnatural shapes before dying prematurely. Morrison eventually converted the entire property into pasture land, claiming that even his livestock avoided the area where the academy's buildings had once stood. The records of the academy's operations were officially sealed by order of the colonial government, with access restricted to a small number of officials who were responsible for ensuring that similar programs did not resurface in the future. Families who had lost children at the institution were compensated for their losses through a fund established by the colonial government, but only in exchange for their continued silence about the experimental program and their agreement not to discuss their experiences with any outside parties. This conspiracy of silence proved remarkably effective, ensuring that the true story of the Fletcher Academy remained hidden for over 2 centuries. The few contemporary accounts that survived were dismissed as exaggerated tales of institutional abuse, and the Academy's connection to broader experimental programs was successfully concealed from public knowledge. However, the legacy of the Fletcher Academy extended far beyond the 89 students who died within its walls during its 28 years of operation. The techniques that were developed and tested at the institution would later be employed by both British and American forces during the Revolutionary War, with former students of the Academy serving as military officers who brought their knowledge of psychological warfare and interrogation methods to the battlefield. Variations of the Academy's techniques would resurface during various conflicts throughout American history, including the Indian Wars, the Civil War, and even in the development of psychological warfare methods used during World War I and World War II. The systematic approach to breaking human resistance that the Fletchers pioneered would influence American military and law enforcement practices for generations, often without any awareness of the origins of these techniques in the torture chambers of a colonial academy. The investigation conducted by Thomas Whitmore also revealed that several other institutions throughout the colonies had been conducting similar experimental programs, suggesting that the Fletcher Academy was merely the most visible example of a much larger network of facilities engaged in developing techniques for psychological and physical control. The exposure of these operations led to significant reforms in colonial education policy and the establishment of oversight mechanisms designed to prevent similar abuses in the future. The families who survived the Academy's closure carried with them a profound understanding of the fragility of human rights and the importance of maintaining vigilance against institutional abuse. Many of these families would later become leaders in the movement for American independence. driven in part by their experiences with the arbitrary exercise of governmental power and their understanding of how easily educational and religious institutions could be corrupted when they operated without proper oversight or accountability. The story of the Covenant Academy serves as a particularly American example of how the pursuit of power and social control can corrupt even the most seemingly noble institutions. The Academy's legacy reminds us that the combination of religious authority, educational prestige, and political support can create conditions that allow systematic abuse to flourish for decades without detection or intervention. The techniques developed at the Fletcher Academy would continue to influence American approaches to law enforcement, military operations, and social control well into the modern era, often without any awareness of their origins in the experimental torture chambers of colonial Massachusetts. The Academy's story demonstrates how institutional knowledge of torture and psychological manipulation can be passed down through generations, becoming embedded in official practices and procedures without any recognition of its morally corrupt origins. Thomas Whitmore's investigation also established important precedents for holding educational institutions accountable for their treatment of students and for ensuring that claims of religious or academic freedom cannot be used to shield systematic abuse from public scrutiny. The legal mechanisms that were developed to prosecute the Fletcher family would later be used in other cases involving institutional abuse throughout American history. The final irony of the Fletcher Academy's story lies in the fact that its experimental techniques, originally developed to strengthen colonial control and maintain British authority, would ultimately be turned against the British themselves during the Revolutionary War. Former students and officials who had been involved in the Academy's operations would use their knowledge of psychological warfare and interrogation methods to support the American cause, demonstrating how tools of oppression can sometimes be repurposed in service of liberation. The discovery of the Academy's true nature also highlighted the importance of documentation and record-keeping in exposing institutional abuse. Jonathan Prescott's journal, hidden for over a decade in the foundation stones of the Academy's basement, provided the crucial evidence necessary to understand the full scope of the experimental program and its connections to broader colonial policies. This dark chapter in American colonial history reminds us that the institutions we trust with the education and welfare of our children must be subject to constant scrutiny and accountability. The Fletcher Academy's ability to operate for nearly 3 decades without effective oversight demonstrates the dangers of combining institutional prestige with claims of religious or educational authority and the importance of maintaining robust mechanisms for investigating and preventing abuse. The legacy of the 89 students who died at the Covenant Academy extends far beyond their individual tragedies to encompass the broader lessons their suffering can teach us about the nature of institutional power, the importance of individual rights, and the constant vigilance required to prevent the corruption of educational and religious institutions. Their story serves as a permanent reminder that the price of freedom is eternal watchfulness, and that the most dangerous threats to human dignity often come disguised as efforts to improve and educate. What are your thoughts on this disturbing chapter of colonial American history? Do you believe that similar programs might have operated in other locations throughout early America, or that techniques developed during this period continued to influence American institutions into the modern era? The story of the Fletcher Academy raises important questions about how we can prevent institutional abuse while maintaining respect for educational and religious freedom. Share your theories and reflections in the comments below. And if you found this investigation as compelling and chilling as we did, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more hidden stories from America's past. The truth about our history is often darker and more complex than we imagine. But it's only by confronting these difficult truths that we can ensure they are never repeated and that we remain vigilant against similar abuses in our own time.